At precisely 3:47 p.m., a notification alert disrupted the decades-old quiet sanctuary of Westbrook Academy's library. In moments, 847 mobile devices vibrated in unison, their displays illuminating with an identical photograph destined to ruin 4 people's lives before the evening meal. The image captured Xiomara Delua, partially clothed in a restroom cubicle, completely unaware that a camera lens was recording her private moment from an overhead position. Her personal space had been violated with meticulous planning. However, what escaped everyone's understanding during those initial frantic moments, as shocked reactions, reverberated among the antique. Shelving and fingertips hurriedly distributed the degrading image across numerous online platforms, was the truth. Xiomara wasn't an unsuspecting target. She was a predator who had carefully prepared her snare over 7 months. And the viral photograph coursing through the internet was precisely the catalyst she required to unleash the most catastrophic retribution Westbrook Academy would ever experience. By 3:48 p.m., while her peers murmured and gestured, Xiomara's fingers moved across her computer keys with the exactness of a pianist executing their magnum opus. By 4:15 p.m., Caden Blackwood's complete online presence would vanish into oblivion. And before the clock struck midnight, 3 influential households would be seeking protective orders against their own children, frantically attempting to preserve whatever fragments of their demolished standing remained. The library's harsh fluorescent illumination created stark contrasts across Xiomara's features as she maintained her typing, unmoved by the accusing gestures and malicious amusement encircling her. If that uncomfortable sensation is already forming in your abdomen, making you curious about what awaited these young men, press that approval icon and follow to witness how this develops. And listen, if narratives about underdogs achieving ultimate vindication speak to you, the appreciation feature underneath assists me in delivering more of these compelling revelations. Now, allow me to transport you 7 months backward to comprehend how a newcomer everyone underestimated as vulnerable choreographed the total obliteration of Westbrook's most feared tormentors. 7 months prior, January's harsh freeze had enveloped Westbrook Academy in frozen sheets when Xiomara initially crossed through those formidable wooden entrance doors. The financial aid recipient from nowhere, dressed in second-hand garments that virtually announced poverty to the luxury brand-wearing privileged class commanding these corridors. Her antiquated computer, secured with adhesive tape and resolve, identified her as vulnerable prey before she uttered a single syllable. The library transformed into her refuge, or so everybody assumed. Daily at exactly 2:30 p.m., she occupied the identical corner workspace encircled by massive bookcases that obscured most sightlines, yet positioned her ideally to witness everything occurring in the expansive study area. Fellow students disregarded her existence the way they disregarded furniture. Never understanding those lowered eyes were recording their every routine, organizing their vulnerabilities, archiving their transgressions. Caden Blackwood spotted her on the 3rd day because hunters instinctively identify possible targets. 6 feet 2 inches of inherited smugness clothed in a lacrosse team jacket. He navigated Westbrook's passages like he possessed them, which technically his bloodline nearly did following 3 generations of contributions. His gang trailed with rehearsed arrangement, each participant fulfilling a particular function in their methodically coordinated dominance through fear. Jackson Rivers managed the physical threats, his wrestler's physique and emotionless stare making even educators move aside when he drew near. Dmitry Vulov supervised their online footprint. His parents' technology corporation links furnishing access to instruments that should have been prohibited for adolescents to control. And then there existed Ethan Nakamura, whose creative abilities had been transformed into producing devastating internet jokes and altered photographs that ruined standing immediately. Their initial encounter transpired exactly as Xiomara had anticipated. Following observation of their behaviors for 72 hours, Caden neared her workspace with that distinctive swagger tyrant's master when they've spotted someone who won't resist. His silhouette fell across her economics textbook like a threatening cloud guaranteeing devastation. Curious selection of study location, he stated, his tone bearing that particular quality of threat disguised as artificial warmth. Most scholarship recipients understand better than to assert territory in the primary library. Xiomara's fingers halted on her keyboard for precisely 2 seconds, an intentional pause that implied anxiety without exaggerating the act. I wasn't aware seating was designated. The librarian mentioned students could occupy anywhere. The chuckle that spread through Caden's group contained zero amusement, only the expectation of amusement at another person's cost. Dimitri already held his device ready, prepared to record whatever humiliation would ensue, because everything transformed into material in their perverted social media domain. Technically accurate, Caden proceeded, lifting her economics textbook and browsing through it with intentional carelessness. But there's what's technically permitted, and then there's grasping the unspoken rules of an establishment like Westbrook. You comprehend agreements, don't you? Being a scholarship recipient and everything. The offense struck exactly where he'd targeted it, reminding everyone within hearing distance that Xiomara didn't belong in their realm of inherited wealth and legacy acceptances. She permitted her shoulders to droop marginally, mastering the stance of someone discovering their position in an aggressive environment. Yet her fingers located their placement on the keyboard once more, entering something that caused the illumination to waver for merely an instant. Though nobody linked the two occurrences. I'll locate another place to study by tomorrow, she whispered, collecting her materials with the hasty actions of withdrawal that tyrants found so gratifying to observe. Intelligent girl, Jackson contributed, flexing his knuckles in that predictable intimidation gesture that somehow still functioned on most students. We'd dislike for your scholarship to become problematic due to disciplinary matters. The warning lingered in the atmosphere like toxic vapor as Xiomara gathered her belongings. But what Caden's gang couldn't observe was the slight grin touching the edges of her mouth, concealed by the curtain of dark hair she allowed to cascade across her features. They'd accepted the lure exactly as she'd expected, creating the dynamic that would render her vengeance so much more satisfying when it ultimately materialized. Days transformed into weeks as Xiomara refined her character as Westbrook's latest target. She consumed meals isolated in the dining hall's most distant corner, traversed hallways with lowered gaze, delivered assignments digitally to prevent classroom encounters. Instructors observed but didn't interfere because Caden Blackwood's household had funded the new science edition. And institutional recall ran profound when millions of dollars were at stake. Yet every instance of visible submission fulfilled a greater objective. Her outdated computer, which everyone ridiculed for its obsolete look, housed military-level encryption programs hidden underneath its damaged exterior. Every keystroke gathered information from the educational facilities network. Every access analyzed behaviors. Every exchange documented with scientific accuracy. The initial breadcrumb materialized 3 weeks into the academic term, when Xiomara intentionally abandoned a storage device in the technology laboratory. Its bright pink casing impossible to overlook against the sterile white desks. Ethan discovered it within minutes because she'd scheduled her departure to match his regular visit to modify photographs for the yearbook, a role he'd turned into accessing unflattering images of anyone who opposed their gang. Examine this, Ethan summoned to Dimitri, who was programming something that likely violated numerous federal regulations regarding unauthorized penetration of confidential systems. Scholarship girl abandoned her storage device. The documents inside seemed to be journal writings, inadequately password secured with password 123 that even novice hackers would find offensive. But Xiomara had constructed each entry with psychological exactness, combining authentic particulars with manufactured weaknesses designed to render her seem like the ideal target for their specific variety of cruelty. Entry following entry chronicled her supposed anxieties, her household's invented monetary difficulties, her frantic requirement to preserve her scholarship by preventing any disciplinary measures. She'd even incorporated fabricated images of a deteriorated residence she'd never inhabited, younger siblings who didn't exist, and hospital invoices for a parent who was genuinely a well-compensated software developer residing comfortably in Seattle. This is treasure, Dimitri exhaled, examining the documents with the enthusiasm of someone who'd located hidden wealth. She's essentially provided us everything we require to thoroughly destroy her if she crosses any boundaries. Caden studied the display over his companion's shoulder, his grin expanding broader with each disclosed secret. Transfer the documents to our confidential server. This variety of advantage is too precious to maintain on a storage device someone might take. They duplicated everything, never questioning why someone would password secure such sensitive material with such an evident code. never pondering why the journal writings seemed almost too flawlessly aligned with their concerns. Hunters rarely questioned gifts that simplified tracking easier, and Shiomara had relied on their pride obscuring them to the snares gradually closing around them. February delivered Valentine's Day, and with it an intensification in torment that Shiomara recorded with concealed cameras she'd positioned throughout the educational facility during custodial shifts. She'd obtained the position through the work, study initiative, the ideal disguise for accessing locations students couldn't typically enter while installing monitoring equipment that would eventually supply proof for federal lawyers. The roses materialized in her storage compartment on February 14th. But they weren't a sentimental gesture. Each stem had been colored black, the petals meticulously covered in something that smelled like decomposition, and the card fastened contained a communication cut from publication letters like a serial murderer's declaration. Nobody cherishes charity recipients. Surrender and return home. She transported the roses through the passage, permitting everyone to witness her degradation, permitting them to record her supposed collapse when she discarded them in the waste container with trembling hands. But those identical hands had meticulously conserved one petal in a proof container, the chemical makeup of whatever they'd utilized traceable to a particular art provision establishment where Ethan had made acquisitions on his parents' credit card. The sequence persisted through March and April, each occurrence meticulously arranged to appear random while constructing towards something greater. Food accidentally spilled on her in the dining hall. Assignments stolen from her storage compartment and delivered under someone else's identity. Gossip distributed through anonymous social media profiles about her supposed romantic desperation and household dysfunction. Shiomara tolerated it all with a patience that originated from understanding every moment of anguish was being captured, organized and prepared for display in a courtroom that would destroy her tormentors more comprehensively than any physical altercation ever could. She executed her character flawlessly, the scholarship recipient gradually fracturing under strain, never permitting them to observe the hunter underneath the target's disguise. May materialized with standardized examination that absorbed the educational facility's focus, furnishing ideal disguise for Shiomara to hasten her digital penetration. She'd obtained access to Dimitri's programming projects by merely being present when he entered passwords, her peripheral sight and recall trained to capture keystrokes without seeming to observe. His supposed security protocols collapsed when confronted with someone who grasped that the most vulnerable point in any system was human pride. The confidential server where they preserved their trophy assemblage disclosed terrors that made even Shiomara's stomach revolt. Hundreds of images of female students, many captured without approval, in changing rooms and restrooms utilizing cameras concealed in ventilation openings and ceiling panels. Recordings of students in vulnerable situations at gatherings, some clearly unconscious and incapable of consenting to being filmed. Years of systematic predation archived with the identical pride serial murderers took in maintaining keepsakes. But combined among the proof of their transgressions were their own exchanges, group communications where they conversed about drugging methods, evaluated girls on their susceptibility, organized assaults with the informal efficiency of business meetings. They archived their own culpability so comprehensively that lawyers would subsequently describe it as the most self-condemning proof they'd ever witnessed displayed in a federal proceeding. Shiomara transferred everything to numerous secure servers, including one preserved by a contact she'd established through channels that remained intentionally ambiguous, even in her own consciousness. The Athena Collective had contacted her 6 months before she'd relocated to Westbrook, their standing preceding them through murmured narratives on survivor discussion boards and encoded communication platforms where targets sought vindication, outside conventional systems that had disappointed them. June delivered final examinations, and with them an unusual tension that saturated Westbrook's passages like electricity preceding a tempest. Caden's gang had grown weary with their typical targets, pursuing something more spectacular to conclude. Their senior year before they dispersed to prestigious universities that would accept them despite disciplinary records cleaned by household attorneys and strategic contributions. The planning meetings occurred in Dimitri's vehicle, a Tesla with supposedly advanced anti-monitoring technology that couldn't identify the microscopic transmitter Shiomara had positioned during a staged impact in the parking area. Their voices, transmitted crystal clear as they conversed about their masterwork, the ultimate degradation that would establish their legacy at Westbrook, while destroying someone so comprehensively they'd never recuperate. Restroom photographs are traditional for a purpose, Ethan contended, sketching something on his tablet that transmitted directly to Shiomara's protected documents. But we require an approach that hasn't been executed before, something that will circulate virally beyond merely the educational facility. What about during the academic excellence gathering? Jackson proposed. Everyone will have their devices available already, and she consistently utilizes that second-floor restroom during the intermission because the primary ones are too congested. Dimitri's fingers raced across his device display, retrieving blueprint arrangements of the educational facility that definitely shouldn't have been reachable to students. There's a maintenance access opening above that cubicle. I can position myself there the night preceding, establish the camera, and manage everything remotely. Too hazardous, Caden determined after contemplating the suggestion. We require something that appears more natural, less organized. If this traces back to us, even our households won't be capable of making it vanish. The resolution originated from an unexpected source when Principal Morrison unknowingly furnished the ideal opportunity. The library would experience network maintenance on September 15th, requiring all students to abandon their devices in storage compartments while utilizing temporary computer stations that couldn't access the internet. It generated a window where monitoring would be minimal and defenses would be solid. Shiomara listened to them polish their strategy through summer intermission, their enthusiasm building as September neared. They possessed no concept she'd already prepared countermeasures for every situation they conversed about, including the one they'd ultimately selected. The maintenance opening Dimitri had spotted was already furnished with her own cameras, arranged to capture anyone who attempted to utilize that vantage point for privacy violation. August dissolved into September with unprecedented heat that forced the aged building's air conditioning to surrender before midday each day. Students grew lethargic and irritable, generating the ideal emotional climate for what would transpire. Shiomara had devoted the summer contributing final elements to her snare, including creating links with 3 local legal offices that concentrated in proceedings involving minors and digital transgressions. September 15th materialized like Christmas morning for Caden's gang, their expectation electric as they prepared for what they assumed would be their greatest accomplishment. The library maintenance furnished ideal disguise as students rotated through computer stations, compelled to abandon phones in storage compartments that Dimitri had already penetrated to guarantee their devices would display them in entirely different locations when investigators eventually examined. Shiomara entered the library at 3:30 p.m., her presence unremarkable following months of creating this routine. She labored at her designated station for precisely 12 minutes, resolving calculus exercises with mechanical exactness while her internal clock tallied down to the instant she'd practiced hundreds of times in her consciousness. At 3:42 p.m., she excused herself for the restroom, following the path she'd utilized every Tuesday and Thursday for the complete previous semester. The second-floor restroom was vacant as anticipated, the maintenance labor having interrupted typical traffic routines and methods she'd meticulously calculated. She entered the third cubicle, the one with the malfunctioning lock she'd guaranteed would remain unrepaired by repeatedly submitting work requests that mysteriously disappeared from the system. Above her, concealed in the maintenance opening, Dimitri held his respiration while arranging his device's camera through the space he'd generated the night preceding. His hands trembled slightly with enthusiasm as he composed the capture, anticipating the ideal instant when she'd be most susceptible, most revealed, most degraded. What he couldn't observe from his arrangement was Shiomara's features reflected in the mirror she'd established at a precise angle weeks earlier. Couldn't observe the slight grin touching across her lips as she detected his respiration alter when she commenced removing her cardigan. Her fingers moved with intentional slowness, providing him duration to assume he was capturing precisely what he'd organized, while her own cameras captured every transgression he was perpetrating. The shutter noise was nearly silent, but Shiomara detected it distinctly, just as she detected the quick intake of respiration that ensued when Dimitri understood he'd neglected to silence his device entirely. She proceeded undressing merely enough to guarantee the photograph would be damaging if circulated, but not enough to constitute anything more severe than harassment accusations for him. The equilibrium had to be flawless for what would arrive next. At 3:45 p.m., Dmitri transmitted the image to their group communication with a communication that would subsequently be recited aloud in federal court. Package delivered. Operation Yearbook is complete. Within seconds, Caden had uploaded it to the anonymous confession page he assumed was untraceable, contributing a caption that combined shaming with classist offenses designed to guarantee maximum degradation. Jackson posted it to 3 different social media platforms utilizing disposable profiles they'd generated months earlier. Ethan was already laboring on modified versions, contributing cruel captions and manipulating the image in methods that would haunt him during his eventual therapy meetings in federal prison. At 3:47 p.m., the notification noise shattered the library's quietness as 847 phones obtained the image simultaneously. The chaos that ensued transpired exactly as Xiomara had anticipated, down to which students would gasp, which would chuckle, and which would immediately commence distributing the image without contemplating the repercussions of circulating what was essentially revenge, pornography involving a minor. But while the student body reacted with the foreseeable combination of shock and cruelty, something else was occurring in the digital realm that none of them could observe. The image contained concealed metadata that Xiomara had embedded weeks earlier when she'd penetrated Dimitri's device, code that activated the instant the photograph was distributed. It functioned like a digital pathogen, but instead of eliminating information, it assembled it, tracing every distribution, every viewing, every remark back to its origin with scientific exactness that would make FBI analysts weep with satisfaction. At 3:48 p.m., as murmurs and amusement filled the library, Xiomara returned to her computer station and opened her laptop. Her fingers raced across the keyboard with the liquid elegance of someone who'd been programming since youth, someone whose parent had genuinely taught her digital combat long before cruel girls and foolish boys transformed into her targets. The initial assault was surgical, targeted directly at Caden's monetary existence. His trust fund, that golden safety net that had shielded him from repercussions his complete life, commenced hemorrhaging currency through transactions he seemed to be authorizing himself. Every charitable organization focused on assisting sexual assault survivors obtained contributions in his identity, complete with communications admitting his transgressions and pleading for forgiveness he'd never genuinely pursued. The magnificence of the assault resided in its authenticity. Every transaction followed appropriate protocols, utilized his genuine authorization codes, and originated from IP addresses traced directly to his devices. When investigators subsequently attempted to demonstrate the transfers were fraudulent, they discovered only proof that Caden had experienced a crisis of conscience and determined to redistribute his prosperity to those he'd injured. The legal structure of irrevocable charitable contributions meant the currency could never be retrieved. By 3:52 p.m., Jackson's realm commenced collapsing through a different vector. Every recording he'd captured of unconscious girls at gatherings commenced uploading to his social media profiles, but not to the public timeline. Instead, they posted directly to his household's feeds, tagged with relatives spanning 3 generations. His grandmother, the federal judge who'd shielded him from previous accusations, obtained a particularly comprehensive package that included audio of Jackson chuckling about drugging her favorite intern at last year's Christmas gathering. The uploads seemed so authentic that even cybersecurity specialists would subsequently struggle to explain how someone could fabricate such detailed digital fingerprints. Every post originated from Jackson's verified devices, utilized his biometric information, and followed his typical posting routine so closely that his own parents didn't initially question their authenticity. Meanwhile, Ethan discovered that artistic ability meant nothing when every college admissions office simultaneously obtained portfolios of his labor, but not the pieces he'd submitted. Instead, they received the assemblage he'd concealed on encrypted drives, the manipulated photographs of female students transformed into degrading internet jokes, the deep fakes he'd generated of teachers in vulnerable situations, the complete catalog of cruelty he'd produced over 4 years of unchecked predation. The timestamps demonstrated he'd generated these during educational facility hours, often in the identical computer laboratories where he was supposed to be laboring on legitimate projects. MIT's response arrived fastest, a terse email declaring he would be permanently prohibited from their campus and any affiliated programs. Other institutions followed within minutes. their rejection letters citing moral turpitude clauses that had seemed like archaic formalities until that instant. At 3:57 p.m., as the complete scope of the catastrophe commenced revealing itself, Dmitri experienced something even more devastating than monetary or academic destruction. Every line of programming he had ever written commenced publishing itself to public repositories, including the backdoors he'd established in his parents' corporation's software, the keyloggers he'd utilized to steal passwords, and most damning of all, the detailed remarks he'd included explaining precisely how he organized to utilize each instrument to injure specific individuals. His parents' corporation stock value would decline 40% within hours as investors understood their security infrastructure had been compromised by the CEO's own child. The Securities and Exchange Commission would initiate an investigation before markets closed, and 3 major clients would terminate contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Dmitri had always prided himself on being the most intelligent person in any room, but he'd never contemplated that someone more intelligent might be observing from the shadows. At 4:30 p.m., something extraordinary commenced occurring across every display in Westbrook Academy. A live broadcast materialized on the educational facility's official website, impossible to terminate despite frantic efforts from IT administrators who suddenly discovered themselves locked out of their own systems. The feed displayed a single figure in shadow, but the voice that emerged was unmistakably that of Ethan Nakamura's younger brother, speaking with the fractured cadence of someone finally releasing years of suppressed trauma. "My identity is Ryan Nakamura," the voice commenced, each word heavy with the weight of truth being spoken for the initial time. "And I need to tell you what my brother and his companions did to my girlfriend before she took her own life last summer." The confession that ensued would subsequently be submitted as proof in 3 separate criminal trials. But in that instant, it functioned as the catalyst for complete systemic collapse. Ryan chronicled gatherings where beverages were spiked, photographs captured of unconscious targets, and a scoring system that transformed sexual assault into sport. He possessed dates, times, locations, and most devastating of all, he possessed recordings of his brother boasting about each conquest. Shyomara proceeded typing as chaos erupted around her. Students frantically examining their devices to discover their own secrets being revealed. Not everyone. Just those who had participated in or enabled the systematic abuse that had plagued Westbrook for years. The selectivity of the assaults rendered them more terrifying, demonstrating that whoever was behind this understood everything about everyone and was selecting their targets with intentional exactness. By 4:15 p.m., Caden Blackwood stood frozen in the library's main hall, observing his complete realm evaporate through a display he couldn't manage. His trust fund transfers had exceeded $3 million, every cent directed to organizations his household had devoted generations opposing. His parent was already calling, the senator's voice bearing through the device with volcanic fury that guaranteed repercussions Caden had never faced previously. But worse than monetary ruin was the email that materialized from Harvard at 4:18 p.m., copying his parents and the complete educational facility board. His early admission had been revoked, not merely for the current application cycle, but permanently. The detailed explanation cited proof of criminal behavior that violated their code of conduct in methods that no amount of household influence could overcome. Observing all of this transpire from that library corner where she'd tolerated months of torment, you have to ponder, would you have anticipated 7 long months for vengeance like Shyomara did? Or would you have struck back immediately? Drop your thoughts in the remarks underneath, because I'm genuinely curious whether patience or instant karma is your style when vindication needs to be fulfilled. The noise of running footsteps announced the arrival of educational facility security, but they seemed confused about who to apprehend. The target in the photograph was calmly laboring at her computer while her attackers were having very public collapses throughout the building. Principal Morrison materialized, his features flushed with the particular shade of crimson that implied his blood pressure medication wasn't quite enough for this situation. "Everyone remain calm," he announced, though his voice fractured on the final word. "We're investigating the situation and cyber assaults against our students. The police have been notified." Shyomara finally looked up from her display, establishing eye contact with Morrison for the initial time since she'd materialized at Westbrook. Something in her gaze made him step backward involuntarily. a prey response to a predator he'd failed to identify until too late. She closed her laptop with intentional slowness, standing with the liquid elegance of someone who'd been trained in movement since youth. "Principal Morrison," she stated, her voice bearing clearly across the silent library. "I believe you'll want to examine your email. The FBI has some questions about your management of sexual assault complaints over the past 6 years." The principal's device vibrated before he could respond, and the color drained from his features as he read whatever had just materialized. Around them, more devices were illuminating with notifications as parents obtained comprehensive packages documenting their children's transgressions or victimization. Meticulously sorted to guarantee maximum impact, Caden finally discovered his voice, charging toward Shiomara with the variety of rage that had consistently gotten him what he desired before. "You did this. You destroyed everything. I'll eliminate you." But his forward momentum halted abruptly when Shiomara shifted her stance slightly, something in her posture implying capabilities that none of them had imagined the scholarship girl might possess. Jackson grabbed Caden's arm, restraining him back with uncharacteristic wisdom born from identifying a fight they couldn't win. "Who are you?" Dmitri inquired, his voice hollow with the comprehension that his complete digital empire had been conquered by someone he'd dismissed as technically incompetent. No freshman could accomplish this. No individual could even access those systems. Shiomara smiled for the initial time since the photograph had been circulated, and several students stepped backward from the predatory satisfaction in that expression. "You're correct. I'm not a typical freshman. I'm not even genuinely a student here, not in the method you comprehend it." She retrieved her device, swiping to an image that made Caden's gang freeze in identification. It displayed another girl physically identical to Shiomara, but somehow fundamentally different, fractured in methods that photograph couldn't fully capture. The timestamp displayed 3 years ago at a different private educational facility, one they all identified from similar incidents that had been concealed through household connections. "This is Serafina Delua," Shiomara stated, her voice dropping to something dangerous. "My twin sibling. 3 years ago, she attended Ridgemont Prep, where a group very much like yours assumed it would be entertaining to document her collapse through increasingly cruel pranks and invasions of privacy. The library had become entirely silent, except for the humming of computers and the distant noise of sirens growing closer. Every student present would subsequently describe feeling like they were witnessing something historic, though none could articulate precisely what that something was. The photographs they captured of her were circulated to every college she'd applied to, every household companion, every potential employer for the remainder of her life. She attempted to end her own life 4 times before finally succeeding in something else entirely, becoming someone new, someone who could never be injured that method again. Shiomara swiped to another photograph, this one displaying someone who might have been Serafina, but transformed beyond identification. Short hair, different identity, different gender presentation entirely. The person in the image appeared confident in methods the fractured girl never had, but the eyes remained haunted by trauma that no amount of reinvention could fully erase. "Lysander Chen is content now," Shiomara proceeded, utilizing masculine pronouns with careful deliberation. "He's studying neuroscience at Johns Hopkins, researching trauma recovery and assault survivors. But I never forgot the boys who fractured my sibling so comprehensively she had to become someone else entirely to survive." "That wasn't us," Ethan protested weakly. "We didn't even understand about Ridgemont." "No," Shiomara agreed. "But you understood their ringleader. You've been exchanging tactics with him through encrypted channels for 2 years, distributing photographs and recordings like trading cards. His identity is Maximilian Sterling, and he's currently being arrested in Boston thanks to proof I furnished to federal authorities this morning." The weight of their situation commenced settling on Caden's gang like gravity suddenly tripling. This wasn't merely about high school degradation or even college admissions. They'd been caught in a web that spanned multiple states, multiple educational facilities, potentially federal transgressions that carried genuine prison sentences. "The Athena Collective," Dmitri exhaled, his features pale with identification. "You're part of the Athena Collective. The ones who dismantled that trafficking ring in Miami, who revealed the coach in Phoenix." Shiomara neither confirmed nor denied the connection, but her silence spoke volumes. The Athena Collective existed in the space between rumor and legend. a network of survivors who'd transformed their trauma into weapons against predators who assumed themselves untouchable. Some stated they were backed by technology billionaires who'd experienced assault themselves. Others claimed they possessed connections to intelligence agencies. Nobody understood for certain, which rendered them infinitely more terrifying. The library doors burst open as federal agents entered, their movements precise and professional in methods that implied this wasn't their initial raid on an educational institution. Special Agent Sarah Chen led the team, her expression grim as she surveyed the scene of teenagers in various states of collapse. Caden Blackwood, Jackson Rivers, Dmitry Vulov, Ethan Nakamura, she announced, reading from a tablet that contained warrants fresh from a federal judge. You're under arrest for violations of federal regulations regarding circulation of intimate images without approval, conspiracy to perpetrate sexual assault, and 37 other accusations that I'll detail once you're in custody. The arrests occurred quickly, but not quietly. Caden fought until agents restrained him, screaming about his rights and his parents' influence that had consistently shielded him before. Jackson went limp, seemingly grateful that someone had finally halted him from becoming something worse. Dmitry typed frantically on his device until agents confiscated it, attempting desperately to activate some failsafe that might minimize damage he finally grasped was irreversible. Ethan just wept, the weight of his brother's confession finally fracturing through years of meticulously constructed justifications. As they were led away, Xiomara opened her laptop again, typing commands that commenced reversing some of the damage she'd inflicted, not all of it. The transgressions would stand and repercussions would follow, but she selectively restored certain things that would permit households to survive, even as their children faced vindication. Why? Principal Morrison inquired, standing in handcuffs as agents prepared to escort him out. Why display mercy now after destroying everything?
Because destruction without purpose is merely vengeance, Xiomara replied, her fingers never pausing in their labor.
And vengeance doesn't heal anything. This was about halting predators and shielding future targets. The currency will assist survivors. The proof will prevent future transgressions. The repercussions will deter others who assumed themselves untouchable. The crowd of students parted as more parents materialized. Some furious and demanding answers, others silent with the identification that their children had been targets they'd failed to shield. Senator Blackwood entered like a storm system, his political power radiating from every gesture until he observed the FBI agents and grasped that his influence ended where federal jurisdiction commenced. You'll compensate for this, he told Xiomara, though the warning lacked conviction when surrounded by federal agents. I don't understand who you genuinely are, but I'll discover. I'll destroy you. Special Agent Chen stepped between them, her hand resting casually on her service weapon. Senator Blackwood, I'd strongly advise against threatening a federal witness, especially one whose cooperation is essential to proceedings spanning 12 states. The revelation that this investigation extended far beyond Westbrook Academy transmitted new waves of panic through assembled parents who suddenly pondered what other secrets might be revealed. Several quickly made phone calls to attorneys, grasping that damage control needed to commence immediately. Mrs. Rivers materialized differently than the others, walking slowly like someone approaching a funeral she'd been expecting. She looked at her child in handcuffs, then at Xiomara, and did something nobody expected. She apologized. I understood, she stated quietly, but her words bore through the silent library. I understood something was wrong with him. I observed the signs, but I selected to believe he would mature out of it. How many girls suffered because I was too cowardly to confront my own child? The question lingered unanswered because there was no acceptable number that would absolve anyone of their complicity. Xiomara studied the woman for a long instant before responding with unexpected gentility. He's 17, she stated, closing her laptop and standing to face Mrs. Rivers directly. Young enough to alter if he receives proper intervention instead of merely punishment. Make sure he receives genuine therapy, not the variety that focuses on preventing repercussions, but the variety that addresses why he assumed injuring others was acceptable. As evening neared and the library gradually emptied of law enforcement and traumatized households, Xiomara discovered herself alone with Special Agent Chen, who'd remained behind after the official arrests were processed. The collective is impressed, Chen stated. producing credentials that implied her connection to the group went deeper than merely FBI liaison. 7 months of flawless preparation, execution that left no traces leading back to you personally, and you managed to prevent any actions that could be prosecuted. Even the photograph incident was engineered to render you purely a target. I learned from the finest, Shiomara replied, finally permitting exhaustion to manifest in her stance. My parent devoted 3 years instructing me digital warfare before she passed away. She stated it would be more beneficial than any martial art in the contemporary realm. She was accurate. The inquiry now is what you accomplish next. Westbrook Academy won't survive this scandal. The households involved will disperse, some to attorneys, some to therapy, some to denial. But you accomplished what you arrived here to accomplish. Shiomara contemplated the inquiry while gathering her few possessions from the desk she'd occupied for 7 months. There are other educational facilities, other predators, other targets anticipating someone to demonstrate to them that resisting is possible even when the system shields those who injure them. Chen smiled slightly, producing a card with nothing but a phone number printed on expensive stock. When you're prepared for the subsequent assignment, contact this number. The collective has been observing, and we believe you're prepared for something greater than high school tyrants. 3 months subsequently, Westbrook Academy existed only as a cautionary narrative told in hushed murmurs at other private educational facilities. The structure had been sold to developers who would transform it into luxury condominiums, its legacy too poisonous for any educational institution to inherit. 23 girls had emerged with narratives of assault and torment dating back a decade. Their voices finally heard because one person had rendered it impossible to disregard them anymore. Caden. Blackwood accepted a plea arrangement that included 2 years in juvenile detention and 10 years of supervised probation. His parent resigned from the Senate after more connections to the network were revealed. His political career destroyed by association with transgressions he'd enabled through willful ignorance. Jackson Rivers obtained intensive therapy at a residential treatment facility, his parent visiting every week to confront the monster they'd both permitted him to become. His wrestling scholarships evaporated, but he seemed almost relieved to be liberated from the strain of preserving his aggressive facade. Dmitry Vulov faced federal accusations that would maintain him imprisoned until his mid-20s. His technical abilities deemed too dangerous to permit any supervised release involving computer access. His parents' corporation survived, but barely, its standing forever tainted by association with systematic predation. Ethan Nakamura selected a different path, testifying against his former companions in exchange for reduced accusations. His artistic ability discovered new expression in generating campaigns for assault prevention, though whether his reformation was genuine or calculated remained debatable. Ryan Nakamura graduated with honors and immediately commenced laboring with survivor advocacy groups, his testimony having liberated dozens of targets from the silence that had shielded their attackers. The live broadcast confession became required, viewing at several law schools studying the intersection of technology and vindication. Principal Morrison served 18 months in federal prison for obstruction of vindication and conspiracy to conceal felonies. The investigation disclosed he'd accepted bribes totaling $400,000 over 6 years to minimize scandals that might affect donor relationships, but the most significant alteration originated from the copycat actions that ensued. Within 6 months, similar operations revealed predator networks at 15 other educational facilities, all following the blueprint Shiomara had created. The Athena Collective never claimed credit officially, but their influence was unmistakable in the exactness of each takedown. Shiomara herself disappeared from public view, though some claimed to spot her at different educational facilities around the country, always in the library, always typing on an outdated laptop that appeared harmless enough. The FBI never confirmed or denied her involvement in subsequent operations, but Agent Chen's caseload mysteriously aligned with wherever Shiomara-like figures materialized. On a rain-saturated evening in December, a new student walked into the library of Preston Preparatory Academy, an elite boarding educational facility with murmured narratives of a secret society that had operated with impunity for decades. She discovered a corner workspace, retrieved a battered laptop secured together with adhesive tape, and commenced typing. The girl wore second-hand garments and maintained her head lowered when the educational facility's golden boys walked past. Their amusement sharp with cruel potential. They dismissed her immediately as another scholarship student who wouldn't last the semester, never noticing the slight grin that touched across her lips as she listened to them organize their subsequent conquest. Her display displayed an encrypted communication from someone identified only as XD that read simply, 7 months minimum. Make it count. She typed back a single word, always. In the reflection of her laptop display, barely visible unless you understood to look for it, was a small tattoo on her wrist, a tiny owl that might have been decorative or might have been something more. The identical symbol that every Athena Collective operative wore, a reminder that wisdom originated from observing, anticipating, and striking when predators least expected their prey to transform into hunters. The Preston boys proceeded laughing, oblivious to the countdown that had already commenced. Somewhere in a federal detention center, Caden Blackwood woke from nightmares about typing noises and notification alerts, grasping finally that the most dangerous predators were the ones you never observed coming. And in a quiet residence 3 states away, Xiomara Delua opened her laptop to discover 17 new proceedings anticipating review. 17 more educational facilities were targets. Needed someone to demonstrate to them that vindication was possible even when the system failed. She selected the subsequent target methodically, already calculating the 7 months it would require to destroy another network of predators who assumed their currency and connections rendered them invincible. The war against systematic abuse would never genuinely end. But for the initial time in generations, the predators had learned to experience fear. They examined over their shoulders in libraries, worried about quiet students with outdated laptops. They hesitated before capturing photographs, pondering if this might be the one that destroyed them. They questioned whether their targets were genuinely as powerless as they seemed, because sometimes the girl you degraded in September was engineering your complete destruction by May. Sometimes the scholarship student you dismissed as vulnerable was documenting every transgression you perpetrated. And sometimes, just sometimes, the hunter appeared exactly like prey until the instant the snare snapped shut.